Pierre Bourdieu. What can I say? Nothing in the world but love for Pierre Bourdieu. He's my favorite modern theorist, and in part because he writes so much about social class and so smartly about social class, like how, like our reading, right? And so, born in 1930, lived until 2002. He grew up working class, so he is one of the few theorists that we have read this term that has grown up in a modest background. However, he does achieve mobility because of education. So he is, kind of like so he's French. He is in a French system similar to Baudrillard, similar to Foucault, who tests their students and then, kind of places them on tracks based on where they perceive their successes to be, right, or their academic levels. And so Bourdieu tests very high, and so he gets to go to effectively like this really good boarding school in France for secondary education. And while he's there, he becomes fixated on class reproduction. And so, what he sees is that even though he has gained access to this elite education, he kind of sees both how many of his contemporaries in this boarding school are just elite people being reproduced by elite people, right? So they have elite parents, they've had elite educations, then they continue in this elite education. And he also sees, so that's like one part of it. The second part of it is he sees just how kind of inferior his preparations have been, that he has never been prepared to kind of interact with people in the same way. He doesn't have the same knowledge base that they do. And that, again, really gets him thinking about schools as a mechanism of social class reproduction. It also makes him a radical, right? So it radicalizes him and makes him largely anti-establishment. He wanted, through his scholarly work, his goal was to expose the role of schools in perpetuating inequality. So he becomes a high school teacher, much like many of the people that we read to this year, right? So like shout out to high school teachers. And he entered into the military in part because of compulsory service, because of the French-Algerian War. And so while he was in the military, he was kind of identified as, kind of like this learned person because he had gone to these elite schools. And so they make him a researcher and effectively an anthropologist. So he, kind of is put out there like to try to understand Algeria, right? So what's going on in Algeria, like how do they live, right? Like what's important culturally, in order to help with the military efforts. And he remained in Algeria to do ethnography even after his duty was released. After that, he finally he went back to France, attended the Sorbonne to study sociology and anthropology. And so he started out kind of being more anthropological and culturally oriented, but always kind of is interested in the class structure as well. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why he's the premier scholar to think about the cultural bases of class, right? And he's particularly prepared to do it with his anthropological and sociological backgrounds. So he does become a professor, refuses to get his PhD because, again, like the system, he's anti-establishment. And so he like does all the work, but is like, no, I'm not going to like file this big paper. So he writes a dissertation, which effectively becomes the Logic of Practice, like this hugely cited book in the discipline. While he's getting his PhD, that wasn't his thesis. His thesis was a little bit more anthropological, but again, like doesn't file. So his two books, so I already talked about the Logic of Practice, the second being Distinction, are the most heavily cited books in the discipline, right? Distinction in particular has more citations than any other sociological work. So he's incredibly, incredibly important. And he's very famous in France. So his obituary runs like page 1. When he dies, like A1 on the newspaper, because like he was seen as like a very prominent scholar, right? So much like a Neil deGrasse Tyson or something like that, right? Like somebody in the United States who we idolize culturally, but is also an academic and a scholar, right? Like that's how he was treated in France. So let's see. I mean, he's just really special because at the time of writing in sociology, there was this huge fraction among like people about like, are we going to take the structural approach to sociology? So people we didn't read, but like Talcott Parsons in particular driving this versus like E.O. Wilson and Kenneth Banfield kind of making this real cultural turn in sociology. Like Parsons had Blau, you know, so again, like you can kind of, if you're interested, like look these people up, read a little bit more about them. I'm happy to talk about them with you as well. Um, but there wasn't really any kind of discussion of synthesis, right? So the cultural people were doing their things, the structural people were doing their things, and there was nobody to bring them together. And so Bourdieu was the first person to do that. He is particularly revered in the discipline because he is responsible for reuniting it. There was a large belief for a while, particularly in the 1950s, that sociology was going to fracture into all of these little subdisciplines. And it's largely because of Bourdieu bringing people together and through the conversations that a lot of sociologists believe that we still have a discipline. So, you know, thanks. So, you know, he is, in terms of his ideas, he is very much rejects structuralism, right? So he doesn't like the way that structuralism in a Durkheimian sense or in a Parsonian sense in what he is reading at the time makes an individual feel mechanical, right? He believes that people are instrumental and that we make choices that shape the system, right? Effectively, we are tools of the system. And so when we're thinking about things like social class or institutions or whatever, right, we have to think of the role of the individual in producing them. So his kind of central problematic, or the thing he is trying to understand more than anything else in his own word, how can behavior be regulated without being the product of obedience to rules? So he largely rejects a Durkheimian notion that it is really just like us conforming to rules and more norms, right, that make us do these things. But it's like, no, right? Like there are lots of ways that we can regulate behavior without just expecting that it being obedience, right? Because again, that's like seizing of agency. So he wants to give people robust agency and the ability to make choices and for their choices to matter, but yet still structure gets created. In terms of some of his big ideas, part of the reason that I want us to read this piece and why I'm sure the textbook selects it is because it introduces us to some of the key ideas. Field being one of his ideas. So this field is this idea of a point of view. And so, you know, like he says, all views taken from a certain point, that is from a given position within a social space. And so because of who we are and kind of our social categories, our statuses, we're only able to see the world in a particular place. And we understand our place in it based on how other people are going, right? And so this is very similar to Mead's, and he's very, he is influenced by Mead's notion of the generalized other, but that like we exist in the world and we see other people around us and we understand the part we're doing, right, in relation to the part that they're doing. And so he likens this, he's European, right? So he likens this as to like a football player, soccer player on a pitch where like, you know what you're doing, you know what they're doing, and like you respond in turn based on, right, those kinds of things. And so our field for Bourdieu is determined by our economic capital, so the material resources that we have access to, and our cultural capital. And so our cultural capital, another of Bourdieu's very central ideas, these non-material goods and expertise, aesthetics, right? Like a knowledge, right? Like knowledge of how to do things. And so, you know, we can transform these various capitals into one another, right? He talks a lot about their exchange values and others of his readings. But like our field is determined where we exist based on the economic access to economic capital and access to cultural knowledge, right? And knowledge capital. When I teach this in my consumption class, we always look at menus to talk about field, right? And so I'm very likely to bring up like a grilled cheese food truck menu versus like 208 Garfield menu, right? In the way that effectively everybody is talking about grilled cheese sandwiches, but the language that they use is very different. And based on your knowledge of food and what is normal to you, right? Like you will read them as grilled cheese sandwiches or not, right? And so, you know, I very distinctly remember taking a student to 208 like a few years back and him being like, what is this, right? Like all these things. It's like, oh, it's just different kinds of cheese, right? It's basically a grilled cheese, right? But if you don't know the various ways that we talk about cheese and the names that the cheese have, right? Like you don't read it as a grilled cheese sandwich. So his other hugely important concept, and this is the concept that gets him so many citations, is the idea of habitus, right? And habitus is a mental filter that structures an individual's perceptions, experiences, and practices that the world takes on a taken for granted common sense appearance, right? And so that is the textbook's language. His language is like, oh my gosh, Pierre, come on. But a structured structure that structures how one views and acts in the world. It structures an individual's experience of and orientation to the social world. But as a structure, the habitus is structured by one's position in social space, which is determined by the volume and types of capital possessed. Like, how many times are we going to use structure in that sentence, right? So, but like basically what he's saying is like our habitus is the way that is our normal, right? It is our normal, and our normal is dictated by how much money and cultural capital we have access to, right? And so if you think about this, another thing that a lot of Bourdieuian scholars kind of point out when they're kind of thinking about habitus, like it is like a normal vacation for us is often dictated by how much money we have access to and how much cultural capital we have access to, right? And so, for some people, like a normal vacation is camping. For other people, a normal vacation is driving to visit family. For other people, a normal vacation is an international kind of destination. For other people, a normal vacation is like a private island, right, on a private jet. And so, like all of those kinds of things, like what we would consider to be normal, right? I'm thinking about if you're watching Succession right now, which like it is the best show on television, so sociological, please watch it. But like there is this kind of exchange where one of the this is about a wealthy family, right? And one of the wealthy siblings of the family has to like fly in like a commercial jet, right? Even though like he's first class and all these kinds of things, right? It was like very disgusting to him, as opposed to riding in what they call PJs, right, or private jets in the show. It is a disgusting view of wealth, right? Again, I highly recommend Succession. And so like in that situation, right, like their amounts of cultural capital and economic capital shape what they think is important, right? It's the same thing, like, like all of these kinds of things that these people, the Roys in the show do is just again, a disgusting display of the destruction of wealth in the most like conspicuously consumative way that you can think of. But that is their normal, right? They don't pause to think about it. They don't think like, is this the way to behave? Like, what does this feel okay or not okay, right? It's just like, it is, right? In the same way that like for me and my family, going to Target feels normal, or, eating at, a local neighborhood burger place feels normal, right? So, in terms of thinking about this, like class then gets reproduced through habitus because it influences our lifestyle choices, it influences our tastes, right? And so all of these things that we do that we think are just like us being us, or like thinking that we're acting in this like normal way, like just being normal people, what we're actually doing is living our classed experiences, right? And so every time I go shopping at the stores that I buy clothing at, right, I am doing that as an affluent person, right? I mean, because I am buying the clothes that feel normal to an affluent person. I'm shopping in the shops that feel comfortable to an affluent person. And so like that then reproduces class time and time again, because if I go to a place that isn't aligned with my class, then I can feel very discomforted, right? So I think about, I remember the first time I went to New York City, I was like, oh, I gotta go shopping on Madison Avenue. I was a sociologist studying consumption, like hardcore at the time, right? And I like went into like some of the stores and it's like, oh, this doesn't feel right, right? And that doesn't feel right because I'm not like the elite, like I'm not the intended audience of Louis Vuitton. And so it makes perfect sense that I would not feel comfortable in one of those stores. That's also true of kind of other stores that just feel uncomfortable to me, right? Like, there are a lot of stores that just feel like they've got, like, especially like lower end stores, feel like they have too much product there, right? And so I feel like, ugh, right, I need the minimalism. I need the minimalism that comes with like a nice Target where they're not even playing music and everything is brightly lit, right? Um, so he talks a lot about symbolic struggle, right? And where, and in the reading for today, about how much we try to use power to legitimate our normal. And that's effectively for him what power is, right? Is setting your normal as the normal. And he also, a particularly important comment or idea of his that I really like is this idea of symbolic violence. And so symbolic violence is basically like lodging a symbolic hit at someone's capital, right? Like by discrediting their prestige, honor, reputation, or charisma. And so symbolic violence, he says in his words, is the acts leading to the misrecognition of reality or distortion of underlying power relations. The dominated perceived the dominant through the categories that the relation of domination has produced and which are thus identical to the interests of the dominants, right? And so effectively, like forcing people into the adoption of your system is a form of symbolic violence, right? And so that is why people get so interested, right, in say like decolonizing a syllabus, right? Because colonization as reproduced in knowledge is symbolic violence against people, right? So like you had the physical violence of colonization, you had the economic violence of colonization, but now you have the symbolic violence of putting forth like, hey, here are our great thinkers and here are their great ideas, with, kind of just like not acknowledging that, oh, that's just like the powerful's position and what they want to produce as being important. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk about social space and the genesis of group quickly, because again, like I didn't want these videos to be long. Apparently that's not within my skill set to make short videos. But Bourdieu is also kind of obtuse, right? And so I'm probably going to skip over some ideas, like the highlighted ideas that I've already talked about, like field habitus, right? I mean, that's the Bourdieu that we need. So he talks about capital, right, on page 690 in column 1. Capital, which may exist in objectified forms, in the form of material properties, or in the case of cultural capital, the embodied state, and which may be legally guaranteed, represents power over a field at any given moment, and more precisely over the accumulated products of past labor, right? And so we experience one another, right? Like how us create structure, right? We all have access to different levels of power. And the way that we use that power, we use that capital in order to, kind of leverage opportunity, to, kind of leverage advantage, that is power, right? And so again, this idea that like the individual is engaging in very meaningful and intentional actions that create structure, right? And so I'm just a person going through the world with a certain amount of economic capital and cultural capital, but as I use those kinds of things to achieve my goals for my children, et cetera, right? Like I am effectively building a power structure in doing that, right? And or denying others access to power as part of that as well. And he says on page 690, the volume of capital determines the aggregate chances of profit in all the games in which cultural capital is effective, thereby helping to determine one's position in social space, right? And so we have all of this capital available to us, right? And it is through that use and lobbying of capital that we are able to build social space. So that creates this idea of the social field. So the social field, 690, column 1, can be described as a multidimensional space of positions such that every actual position can be defined in terms of multidimensional systems of coordinates whose values correspond to the values of the different pertinent variables. Like again, Bourdieu, come on, right? And so we read him for his ideas, not for the way he states them. But again, it's this idea of, like the social field, like again, like all of us have access to these different things. We come together because of our access to these different things in different ways based on our access to these different capitals. And so then we experience the world and our place in it as a result. So habitus then is generative principles of distinct and distinctive practices, what the worker eats, and especially the way he eats it, the sport he practices, the way he practices it, his political opinions and the way he expresses them, and how they are systematically different from the industrial owner's corresponding activities. So habitus is not just a classification, right? Habitus is not class, but it is the system through which we identify what is good and bad, right and wrong, distinguished and vulgar, based on what feels normal to us, right? And so oftentimes we will, through symbolic violence, right, like put vulgarity or disgust on practices that other people have, right? And so I can be like, oh, how can somebody shop in a Dollar General? It is so stuffed. There's just stuff everywhere and it's not clean and blah, 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 right? And I can feel that way because for me, normal feels like shopping in an extremely sterile Target, right? Whereas some people would go into an extremely sterile Target and be like, ugh, like gross, like, oh, all these products together. I need to shop. I need to be at Louis Vuitton, right? And that's what feels comfortable to me. In the next section for classes on paper, Bourdieu talks a lot about classes, right? And he wants us to think about classes not as necessarily something that can manifestly exist. He's talking largely to Marx in this section and the next. But like it is about relations, right? And so, he talks about like, on page 692, I'll use his words, there is no mention of the mysterious alchemy whereby a group in struggle, a personalized collective historical agent assigning itself its own end, arises from the objective economic struggles. And so what he says is like, like there is nothing that makes a class become a political group, right? Like it is people's actions can align them in different ways. And some of the ways in which people become aligned are political. But it is not as if, as Marx argues, that like we can have this reckoning and see ourselves as belonging to classes as a political group, right? Or that classes are inherently political. Classes can become political. Classes are tied to power, right? But they're not necessarily inherently political. Let's see, there's so much I want to talk about, but I want this video to not be super long. And so, so he would say, in his words, he says it's more of a class unconsciousness than a class consciousness in the Marxist sense. Instead, it's this, kind of, again, I'll use his words, the practical mastery of the social structure as a whole that reveals itself through a sense of the position occupied within that structure. And so our class is just our ability to, our comfort level, right? Like our class is people who share a similar field, who experience a similar habitus to us. That is what class is, our place, right? It gives us our knowledge of the social world. And so that makes it possible then, he says on page 693, column 2, to create political struggle, right? Because there is this theoretical and practical struggle for power in order to prioritize our way, or at least to fight for acceptance of our way of doing things. So Bourdieu actually doesn't believe that we necessarily want superiority, right? But we do want recognition. We want dignity in what we do and our choices, right? And so we don't want someone saying like, ugh, like how can they like Target? How could they drive a Honda? That's so gross, right? But instead to think that like all those choices are fine, right? And what we're really trying to do as classes is trying to get this recognition and dignity of all of the things that we do. So on 694, distinction does not necessarily imply the pursuit of distinction, as is often supposed following Veblen. All practice of consumption visible, whether it is performed or not seen. Distinction in the ordinary sense of the word is the difference inscribed in the very structure of the social space, when perceived through the categories adapted of that structure. Symbolic capital, another name for distinction, is nothing more than capital of perception arising from the internalization of the structure of its distribution. So it is naming our normalcy, right? It is the ability to kind of put a name to it. And so then he goes to this whole idea of the symbolic order and the power to name. And that is why there's oftentimes so much fight politically around who can name something and what name something has, right? Because like it is one way to legitimate or to delegitimate in terms of thinking about naming. And in terms of recognizing who can and can't have the power to name groups or identify whose groups are important or whose voices are valued, is establishing the hierarchy, right? So another way through individual actions, creating these social hierarchies. So as individuals, again, existing in groups, we just want to be recognized, we just want to be validated. And sometimes powerful actors say, yeah, your group, they exist. Let's talk about them. Let's make sure their needs are met. And then sometimes people say, no, your group is silly, or your group is dumb, or like you don't actually have anything in common that you think you do. We know better, right? Or whatever. And so they don't listen to people's voices. And so that then delegitimates them and strips them of power. So, class then, he has in the section class as the representation of will. Very, very interesting in terms of discuss kind of a way to engage Weber's idea that power is positional, not personal, right? And so Weber gives us this idea that like it isn't people who can have power, or if they do, it's charismatic and it's very fleeting, but instead power comes based on your position or based on, something like structural, right? And so then like once a person leaves that post, then the power stays, but the person goes, right? And so Bourdieu is very much underwriting this and also giving us this idea that class is the same way, right? And that's like why we can have mobility, because class exists within the structure. And so people can move through the structure, but that doesn't mean that class changes in any meaningful way, right? Like you achieve mobility upward or downward, and then someone else just like comes in and fills, right? Comes and finds your normal. So, he talks about politics as being the sphere where we are able to create groups and create political representation. And so, like in terms of thinking about naming it, he says more generally, all utterances which have as their subject a collective noun, people, class, university, school, state, etc., presuppose the existence of the group in question and conceal the same sort of metaphysical bootstrapping that was denounced in the ontological argument. The spokesman is he who, when speaking of a group on behalf of a group, surreptitiously posts the existence of the group in question, institutes the group through the magical operation that is inherent in any act of naming. That is why one must perform a critique of political reason, which is inextrinsically inclined to the abuses of language that are also the abuses of power, if one wants to power the question with all the sociology ought to begin with, of the existence and the most existence of collectives. So much to unpack here, right? But part of what, we need to think about when we're thinking about power, right? It comes with naming, because like that, the naming is the way to get it into the conversation, right? And once we have an issue, a group of people, whatever, in the conversation, like then they become something that can have wishes, have desires, have rights, have needs, right? All of these things that then we can leverage in terms of trying to mobilize for power, right? So without name, there can't be power. And that's why there is oftentimes so much effort to name it. And so a class then, and he says on 699 in columns 1 into 2, a class insofar and only insofar as mandated representatives endow with play potesta agenda can be and feel authorized to speak in its name in accordance with the question, the party is the working class or the working class is the party. And so to make it exist as a real force within the political field. And so again, like this idea that like there is no like true working class, like it certainly isn't a monolith that can speak in one voice. However, once it gets named, it kind of assumes what Bourdieu calls this mystical body that can then act, right? And so we make it into being, and then it allows to become this like structural entity.